The Cartographer's Daughter. Chapter 1. Lines on Paper. Elena Vasquez had always believed that maps told the truth. Unlike photographs, which captured a single moment and claimed it as forever, or paintings, which bent reality to the artist's will, maps were honest. They showed what was there. The curve of a coastline, the elevation of a mountain, the precise distance between 2 points in space. This faith had sustained her through 34 years of life, including the last 8 spent working as a senior cartographer for the National Geographic Survey. But standing in her father's study 3 days after his funeral, surrounded by towers of hand-drawn maps that defied every principle of accurate cartography she'd ever learned, Elena felt that faith beginning to crack. The maps were beautiful, she had to admit that. Rendered in her father's meticulous hand, they depicted places that couldn't possibly exist. An island shaped like a sleeping woman, complete with flowing hair made of tributary rivers. A mountain range that spelled out words in an alphabet Elena didn't recognize. Cities with names like Esperanza de los Sueños and Port Remembrance. Their streets laid out in patterns that resembled musical notation. Her mother appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Maria Vasquez moved carefully these days, as if the grief had made her bones more brittle. "I kept meaning to ask him about those," her mother said, nodding toward the maps. "But there was never time, and then—" Elena accepted the coffee gratefully. The house still smelled like her father, Old Spice aftershave and the particular mustiness of old paper. How long was he working on them? Years. Maybe decades. I'd hear him in here late at night, drawing. Sometimes I'd find him asleep at his desk in the morning, his face pressed against one of those maps like he was trying to crawl inside it. Elena studied the map nearest to her. It showed what appeared to be a continent, but the proportions were all wrong. The scale shifted dramatically from region to region, some areas rendered in minute detail, others sketched broadly as if seen from a great height. In the bottom right corner, in her father's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Territory of the Heart, Survey Incomplete." "Did he ever explain them to you?" Her mother shook her head. "Your father wasn't much for explanations. You know that. He preferred to let his work speak for itself." This was true. Roberto Vasquez had been a man of few words, expressing himself through the precise lines and careful measurements of his professional maps. He'd worked for the State Highway Department for 40 years, charting roads and plotting boundaries with the dedication of a monk illuminating manuscripts. Elena had inherited his love of accuracy, his respect for the observable world. But these maps suggested a different side of her father entirely. "There's something else," her mother said. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Elena's name was written across it in her father's handwriting. "He left this for you specifically. Said to give it to you after." Elena set down her coffee and took the envelope. The paper was heavy, the kind her father had always preferred for important documents. Inside was a single sheet, covered in his familiar script. "My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, then I have taken my final journey, and you have discovered my secret work. I know these maps must seem strange to you, trained as you are in the discipline of literal truth. But I hope you will understand that there are territories that exist beyond the reach of GPS satellites and survey instruments. Each of these maps charts a place I have been in my heart, a landscape of memory and longing that is no less real for being invisible. The island of first love was where I met your mother, though it happened to be located in Lincoln Park in Chicago. The mountains of becoming marked the years when I struggled to understand who I was meant to be. The city of small sorrows. Well, that's where I lived during the year after we lost your brother. I know you think maps should show only what is. But sometimes, Mija, what is includes what we carry inside us. The geography of the heart is as real as any mountain range, and it deserves to be charted with the same care we give to rivers and roads. There is one more map I could never bring myself to complete. It's in the bottom drawer of my desk, under the folders marked Personal. I started it the day you were born, but I could never find the right way to draw the territory of being your father. Perhaps that is a map only you can finish. Can't do me amor. Papa. Elena read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Her hands were shaking slightly. What does it say? Her mother asked. Instead of answering, Elena walked to her father's desk and opened the bottom drawer. Under a stack of folders she found it. A half-finished map titled The Country of Elena. The coastlines were barely sketched, the interior mostly blank except for a few scattered features: Bay of First Steps, Forest of Bedtime Stories, River of Piano Lessons abandoned, Mountain of the Day she left for college. She spread the map on the desk and stared at it. In the center of the unfinished continent was a note in her father's handwriting. Here there be dragons, the fierce and beautiful kind. Chapter 2, Uncharted Waters. Elena spent the rest of that week going through her father's papers, but she kept returning to the maps. There were dozens of them, each more intricate than the last. Some were clearly autobiographical. The archipelago of Roberto's regrets featured small islands named things like should have called more and shouldn't have worked late. Others seemed to chart shared experiences. The matrimonial peninsula showed a landmass shaped like two hands clasped together, with cities named First Fight and Making Up and Learning to share the remote control. But it was the unfinished map, her map, that haunted her. She'd always prided herself on being practical, rational, guided by measurable facts. In her work, she dealt with elevation data and satellite imagery, with coordinates that could be verified and boundaries that could be surveyed. The idea that her father had spent years trying to map something as intangible as his relationship with her felt simultaneously touching and absurd. Yet she found herself studying the scattered landmarks he'd managed to chart. River of Piano Lessons abandoned. She remembered quitting piano at age 12, despite his gentle encouragement to continue. Mountain of the Day she left for college. She'd been so eager to leave home, to prove her independence, that she'd barely looked back as he helped her load her car. Forest of Bedtime Stories, though that brought back vivid memories. Her father, who was so quiet during the day, had transformed at bedtime into a storyteller of remarkable imagination. Night after night, he'd spun tales of brave princesses and clever animals, of magical kingdoms hidden in everyday places. She'd loved those stories, had begged for just one more, but somewhere along the way, maybe when she started middle school, she decided she was too old for such things. On Thursday evening, Elena's phone rang. It was her colleague David Chun from the survey office. "Hey, I know you're still on bereavement leave, but I thought you'd want to know. We got that satellite data you were waiting for on the Colorado River project." Elena had completely forgotten about the Colorado River project. It seemed impossible that her regular work continued to exist while her world had been turned upside down. "Thanks, David. I'll look at it when I get back. You doing okay? I know this has been rough." "I'm fine," she said automatically, then realized it wasn't true. "Actually, no. I'm not fine. My father left me something strange, and I can't figure out what to do with it." There was a pause. David had worked with her for 5 years, and she'd never shared anything personal with him before. "Want to talk about it?" So she told him about the maps, about the territories of the heart, about the unfinished continent that bore her name. She expected him to react with the gentle skepticism she would have shown if their positions were reversed. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My grandmother did something similar. Not maps, but she kept journals where she wrote about her life as if it were a series of countries she'd visited. The country of new motherhood, the desert of middle age, stuff like that. I thought it was just her being poetic, but after she died, reading those journals, I don't know. It helped me understand her better." "What did you do with them?" "I kept them. Sometimes I read them when I'm trying to figure something out in my own life. It's like she left me a guidebook." After they hung up, Elena returned to her father's study. She pulled out The Country of Elena and spread it across the desk, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. Then she found a pencil, one of her father's old drafting pencils perfectly sharpened, and stared at the blank spaces. Where would she put the valley of teenage rebellion? The cliffs of career ambition? What about the swamp of that terrible relationship with Marcus? Or the bright peninsula of getting her first job at the survey? She started with something small, a dot labeled Village of Learning to Drive. Her father had been endlessly patient during those lessons, never raising his voice even when she'd accidentally backed over his prized rose bush. The act of drawing felt strange at first. Her work maps were all digital now, created with sophisticated software and based on precise measurements. But there was something meditative about the simple act of pencil on paper, of translating memory into geography. She drew a small river connecting the Village of Learning to Drive to a larger feature, City of High School Graduation. She could still see her father in the audience that day, beaming with pride, his camera flashing constantly despite her embarrassed protests. Hours passed without her noticing. When her mother called her for dinner, Elena looked up to find that she'd filled in nearly a quarter of the blank continent. The pencil marks were tentative, often erased and redrawn, but something was taking shape, a landscape that felt both foreign and familiar. Chapter 3: Scale and Proportion. The next morning, Elena woke with an odd sense of purpose. She made coffee and toast, kissed her mother goodbye, and drove to the public library. She'd had an idea during the night, sparked by her conversation with David, the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez who'd known Elena since childhood, helped her locate the local history section. Elena spent the morning reading about the early cartographers, the explorers who'd mapped unknown territories with tools that seemed primitive by modern standards. She learned about the Here Be Dragons inscriptions that medieval mapmakers used to mark unexplored regions, and about the way maps evolved as knowledge grew. Coastlines redrawn, mountains relocated, entire continents repositioned. But what fascinated her most were the stories of indigenous maps, created by people who understood their territories intimately, but expressed that knowledge in ways that seemed alien to European sensibilities. Maps that showed not just physical features but seasonal changes, hunting grounds, spiritual sites. Maps that included the dimension of time, showing how a landscape transformed through the year or across generations. These weren't inaccurate maps, Elena realized. They were maps with a different definition of accuracy. She thought about her father's explanation. The geography of the heart is as real as any mountain range. Maybe he'd been trying to create a new kind of cartography, one that could chart the territories most maps ignored. That afternoon, she called in sick to work and spent several hours with her father's maps, studying them with fresh eyes. She began to see patterns she'd missed before, recurring themes and careful symbolism. The maps weren't random fantasy. They were systematic attempts to visualize emotional and psychological terrain. The archipelago of Roberto's Regrets wasn't just a collection of whimsically named islands. It was a carefully structured exploration of remorse and resolution. Some islands were large and heavily detailed, major regrets that had shaped his life. Others were tiny and sketched lightly, minor disappointments that had faded with time. The currents between the islands showed connections Elena was only beginning to understand. She pulled out The Country of Elena again and studied what her father had managed to chart. Bay of First Steps was connected by a river to Forest of Bedtime Stories, suggesting a relationship between those early milestones and the stories he'd told her. Mountain of the day she left for college stood alone in one corner, surrounded by what he'd labeled the neutral zone, perhaps representing the emotional distance that had grown between them as she pursued her independent life. The more she studied the map, the more she realized how much thought had gone into it. Her father had been trying to understand their relationship with the same methodical care he'd brought to his highway surveys. Elena picked up the pencil and began to work. She drew the rapids of adolescent arguments, All those fights about curfews and friends and her future. But she connected them to Lake Reconciliation, where they'd always managed to find their way back to each other. She added the plateau of shared interests, marking the years when they'd bonded over his work, when he'd taught her to read topographical maps and shown her how to use a compass. As the afternoon wore on, the map grew more complex. She found herself remembering conversations she'd forgotten, moments of connection and disconnection that had shaped who they were to each other. The act of drawing seemed to unlock memories, as if the physical process of creating the map was excavating buried experiences. Her mother found her there at dinner time, surrounded by maps and sketches, her hands smudged with graphite. "You look like your father," she said softly. "That's exactly how I'd find him. Lost in his maps, forgetting the world outside." Elena looked up. "Mom, did you know about what these maps meant to him?" Maria sat down in the chair across from the desk. "I suspected. Your father. He felt things very deeply, but he had trouble expressing it directly. These maps were his way of making sense of his emotions, I think. His way of understanding the territory of his own heart. Why didn't he ever show them to me? Maybe he was afraid you'd think they were foolish. You were always so practical, so focused on facts and measurements. He used to worry that he'd passed on his love of maps but not his ability to see the poetry in them." Elena looked down at the map she'd been working on. The country of Elena was taking shape, becoming a real place with its own logic and beauty. She was beginning to understand what her father had been trying to give her. Chapter 4. Landmarks and Legends. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena threw herself into the project of completing her father's map. She took extended leave from work, telling David that she needed time to process her grief, which was true, though not in the way he probably imagined. Each day brought new discoveries. As she worked on mapping her own emotional geography, she found herself calling her father's colleagues, his old friends, even distant relatives, asking about their memories of him. She was trying to understand the man who had created these extraordinary charts of the heart. Her father's former supervisor at the highway department, a gruff man named Bill Morrison, surprised her with his insight. "Your dad was the best surveyor I ever worked with," he said. "But he was different from the others. Most of us, we see the land as something to be measured and documented. Roberto saw it as something alive, something with its own stories to tell. He could read a landscape like other people read books." Elena's Aunt Carmen, her father's younger sister, had different memories. "Roberto was always drawing even as a child," she said. "But not just maps, he drew stories. Pictures of places that existed only in his imagination. Our mother used to worry he was too much of a dreamer to make it in the world." "What changed?" Elena asked. "He met your mother. She helped him see that dreaming and practicality didn't have to be opposites. She encouraged him to become a surveyor, because she said it would let him explore the world for a living." These conversations helped Elena understand the evolution of her father's cartography. His professional work had satisfied his need for exploration and precision, but the fantasy maps were where he'd processed the unmappable aspects of life: love, loss, memory, hope. As she worked on the country of Elena, the map became increasingly detailed and personal. She drew the suburb of teenage embarrassment, where every street was named after a mortifying high school moment. She created the University Peninsula, connected to the mainland by a bridge labeled Scholarship, and surrounded by the sea of new possibilities. But the most challenging features to map were the recent years, the period of increasing distance between her and her father. How do you chart the geography of growing apart? How do you measure the space that opens between people who love each other but don't know how to connect? Elena drew the desert of busy lives, a vast expanse where phone calls became brief and visits grew infrequent. She added the mountains of unspoken words, all the things they'd meant to say but never found the time or courage to express. But as she worked, She began to see that even these difficult territories had their own beauty. The desert of busy lives wasn't just about distance. It also contained the oasis of career success and the springs of independence. The mountains weren't just barriers, they were also landmarks that gave shape to the emotional landscape. 3 weeks into the project, Elena made a discovery that changed everything. She was organizing her father's desk drawers when she found a small notebook, hidden behind a stack of old maps. Inside were pages of notes, written in her father's careful handwriting, observations about cartography, philosophy, and the nature of place. One entry, dated just 6 months before his death, particularly struck her. Elena called today to cancel dinner again. Big project at work. I was disappointed, but then I realized her dedication to her craft is something I helped nurture. The territory of fatherhood includes the bittersweet province, where pride and sadness occupy the same space. I am proud of who she has become, even when that person doesn't have time for me. Elena had to stop reading. She remembered that canceled dinner. She'd been working on a crucial deadline, mapping flood zones for emergency planning. She'd rescheduled 3 times before giving up, promising to call him soon. She never had. But there were other entries too, more recent ones. Watched Elena's interview on the local news about the new river mapping project. She explained the work with such passion and clarity. Listening to her, I understood that she sees maps the way I do, not just as technical documents but as ways of understanding the world. Maybe we're not so different after all. Started working on Elena's map again today. I think I've been approaching it wrong, trying to chart our relationship from my perspective alone. A territory belongs to everyone who inhabits it. Maybe the map can only be completed when we work on it together. The notebook contained dozens of such entries spanning years. Elena realized that her father had been trying to understand her with the same careful attention he'd brought to surveying rivers and roads. He'd been mapping their relationship from both sides, trying to chart the territory they shared. Chapter 5: Confluence. That evening, Elena called her mother into the study. "I want to show you something," she said, spreading the country of Elena across the desk. The map was nearly complete now, filled with the landmarks of a lifetime. But as she looked at it, she realized something was missing. "Mom, where are you in this map? Where's Dad? He was trying to chart the territory of being my father, but that territory includes you too." Her mother studied the map, tracing the rivers and coastlines with her finger. "Maybe that's why he couldn't finish it," she said. "Maybe he realized that no one person can map a relationship alone." Elena nodded. She picked up the pencil and in the center of the continent where her father had left the largest blank space, she began to draw a new feature: the Central Valley of Family. She sketched 3 rivers flowing together, one from the heights of Roberto's love, one from the plateau of Maria's wisdom, and one from the springs of Elena's growth. Where the rivers met, she drew a lake and labeled it Confluence. "This is where we all came together," she said. "This is the territory we shared." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. He would have loved this. Elena spent the next several days adding details to the Central Valley. She drew the small towns where family memories were made: Thanksgiving Village, Christmas Morning Settlement, Birthday Celebration Station. She added roads connecting these places to the other features on the map, showing how family experiences influenced everything else. But the most important addition was a series of bridges. She drew spans connecting her continent to other landmasses, the country of Maria, and the territory of Roberto, showing that while each person's emotional geography was unique, they weren't isolated. They were part of an archipelago of interconnected places, linked by love and shared experience. When the map was finally complete, Elena sat back and looked at what she'd created. It wasn't accurate in any traditional sense. The scale was inconsistent, the projections impossible, the features purely symbolic. But it told the truth about the territory it charted. It showed the shape of a relationship, the topography of love between a father and daughter. Chapter 6. New Territories. Elena returned to work the following Monday, but she found it difficult to focus on satellite data and elevation models. The maps she created for the survey seemed suddenly lifeless, technically perfect but emotionally empty. During her lunch break, she called David. "I've been thinking about what you said about your grandmother's journals," she said, "about how they helped you understand her better. I think my father's maps have done the same thing for me." "How so?" "I've been seeing him as this quiet, practical man who couldn't express his emotions. But the maps show me someone completely different. Someone deeply thoughtful and incredibly creative. Someone who spent years trying to understand the people he loved." "Sounds like you learned something about yourself too." Elena paused. This was true, but she hadn't fully articulated it yet, even to herself. "I think I've been mapping my life all wrong," she said finally. "I've been so focused on the practical stuff, career achievements, measurable success, that I've ignored the emotional geography. I've been living like the only territories that matter are the ones you can survey with instruments. And now I think maybe the most important maps are the ones you can't satellite image." That afternoon, Elena made a decision that surprised even her. She requested a meeting with her supervisor and proposed a new kind of project. "What if we created maps that showed more than just physical features?" she said. "What if we could visualize how communities experience their landscape? The places that matter to them emotionally, historically, culturally." Her supervisor, a pragmatic woman named Dr. Sarah Winters, looked skeptical. "That sounds more like anthropology than cartography." "Maybe the best cartography includes anthropology," Elena replied. "Maybe we've been thinking too narrowly about what maps can do." Dr. Winters was quiet for a moment, considering. "Do you have a specific proposal?" Elena did. Over the past week, she'd been developing an idea for a community mapping project that would combine traditional surveying techniques with oral history and personal narrative. Residents would be interviewed about the places that mattered to them, not just landmarks and streets, but the spots where they'd fallen in love, where they'd experienced loss, where they felt most connected to their community. "We'd create layered maps," Elena explained. "The base layer would show standard geographic features, but users could toggle additional layers that showed the emotional and cultural landscape, the places that have meaning beyond their physical properties." "It's an interesting idea," Dr. Winters admitted, "but I'm not sure it fits our mandate." "What if it did? What if understanding how people experience place is essential to good planning and development? What if the emotional geography is as important as the flood zones and utility lines?" Elena spent the next month developing her proposal. She researched precedents, found examples of similar projects, and created detailed budget projections. She thought about her father's maps and his belief that the geography of the heart deserved the same careful attention as any mountain range. The turning point came when she presented her idea to the City Planning Commission. One of the commissioners, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, became visibly emotional when Elena explained the concept. "My husband and I met at a bus stop downtown 60 years ago," Mrs. Patterson said. "That corner doesn't look like much. It's just concrete and traffic lights now. But for me, it's sacred ground. It's where my whole life began. If someone was planning development for that area, wouldn't it be valuable to know that it holds that kind of meaning for people?" The commission approved a pilot project. Chapter 7. Community Cartography. Elena's first community mapping project focused on the Riverside neighborhood, a diverse area that was facing pressure from development. She spent weeks walking the streets, talking to longtime residents about the places that mattered to them. Mrs. Chun, an elderly Chinese-American woman, showed her the corner where her family's grocery store had operated for 30 years before being forced to close due to rising rents. "People think it's just an empty building now," she said. But for me, it's where I learned to be American. A group of teenagers took Elena to an abandoned lot where they'd created an informal gathering space. Adults see this as an eyesore, one of them explained, but this is where we come to figure out who we are. A young father pointed out the playground where he'd taught his daughter to walk. It's not the fanciest park in the city, he said, but watching her take her first steps here, this place will always be special to me. As Elena collected these stories, she began to see the neighborhood differently. The standard city maps showed streets and buildings, zoning boundaries and utility lines. But they missed the network of meaning that connected people to place. The invisible infrastructure of memory and emotion that made a geographic area into a true community. Working with a team of designers and programmers, Elena created an interactive digital map that layered these personal geographies onto traditional cartographic information. Users could explore the neighborhood at multiple levels, seeing both the practical infrastructure and the emotional landmarks that gave the place its character. The response was immediate and powerful. Residents who had never engaged with city planning before suddenly became active participants, eager to share their own stories and learn about their neighbors' experiences. Developers began to understand why certain seemingly unremarkable spaces generated fierce community opposition. They weren't just empty lots or outdated buildings, but repositories of collective memory. The pilot project was so successful that Elena received funding for 3 additional community mapping initiatives. She hired a small team of cartographers, oral historians, and community organizers, and together they began developing new techniques for visualizing the relationship between people and place. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Elena received a letter from David's grandmother's former neighbor, a woman who had heard about the community mapping project through a local newspaper article. "I read about your work and thought you should know," the letter said. "Your father came to my house about 5 years ago, asking about the old neighborhood maps in the Historical Society. He said he was working on a project to show how places hold memories. He never explained exactly what he meant, but after reading about your maps, I think I understand. He would be so proud to see you carrying on his work." Chapter 8. The Mapmaker's Legacy. On the first anniversary of her father's death, Elena returned to his study. She'd kept most of the fantasy maps, but she'd also started creating new ones of her own. The walls now displayed a mixture of her father's original cartography and her own contributions, maps of grief and healing, of professional growth and personal discovery. But the centerpiece was still the country of Elena, now completely finished and beautifully rendered. Looking at it, she could trace the full journey of her relationship with her father, from the early territories of childhood wonder through the challenging landscapes of adolescence and young adulthood, to the recent regions of professional collaboration and mutual understanding. She'd added one final feature in the weeks after completing the community mapping project: the bridge of continuing conversation. It connected her continent to a new landmass she'd begun sketching, the territory of his legacy. This new map showed how her father's influence continued to shape her work and her understanding of the world. Her mother joined her in the study, carrying 2 cups of coffee as she had a year earlier. "I've been thinking about something your father wrote in one of his notebooks," Elena said. "He said that maybe the map could only be completed when we worked on it together. I think he was right, but not in the way he expected." "How do you mean?" "I think he thought we'd sit down together and draw it. But actually we've been working on it together all along, our whole lives. Every conversation, every shared experience, every moment of connection or distance. We were mapping the territory of our relationship together. He just found a way to visualize it." Elena pulled out a new project she'd been working on, a map of the Community Mapping Initiative and its impact on the neighborhoods they'd studied. It showed how the process of creating the maps had itself changed the communities, strengthening connections and inspiring new forms of civic engagement. "I'm starting to understand something Dad always knew," she continued. Maps don't just show what's there, they help create it. By mapping our emotional geographies, by taking the time to understand and visualize what matters to us, we make those territories more real, more accessible to ourselves and others. Her mother studied the new map. So what comes next? Elena smiled. I want to expand the community mapping work. But I also want to start teaching other people to create their own personal maps the way Dad taught me without meaning to. I think everyone has territories of the heart that deserve to be charted. Like a cartography of healing? Exactly. Maps that help people understand their own emotional landscapes, navigate their relationships, process their experiences. Maps that show that the geography of feelings is as real and valid as any other kind of territory. Over the following months, Elena developed a workshop series called Mapping the Heart. Participants learned to create their own emotional cartography, charting everything from family relationships to career journeys to personal growth. The workshops attracted a diverse group: therapists who wanted to help clients visualize their healing process, teachers who saw potential for helping students understand their own development, individuals who were simply curious about exploring their inner landscapes. Each session began with Elena sharing her father's story and showing examples of his maps. She'd explain how traditional cartography had evolved from simple wayfinding tools to complex instruments for understanding geographic relationships, and suggest that personal mapping could serve a similar function for emotional and psychological terrain. Your father was a pioneer, said Dr. Martinez, a therapist who had attended one of the workshops. He understood something that psychology is just beginning to recognize: that spatial metaphors aren't just poetic devices, they're actually how we organize our understanding of abstract experiences. When we talk about emotional journeys, about being in a dark place or finding our way, we're not just speaking metaphorically. We're describing real psychological territories. Chapter 9. Uncharted Territories. 2 years after her father's death, Elena's work had attracted national attention. She'd been invited to speak at conferences, had published articles about community mapping in academic journals, and had received a grant to expand her research into therapeutic applications of personal cartography. But the achievement that would have made her father proudest was smaller and more personal. Elena had started drawing again, not just maps, but the kind of imaginative illustrations her father had created as a child. She'd been inspired by a workshop participant, a woman who had created a map of her recovery from addiction as a journey through various mythical lands. Why do the maps have to be realistic? The woman had asked. If we're charting emotional territory, shouldn't we be free to use emotional symbols? Dragons for the things we're afraid of, treasure islands for our goals, storms for the crises we've weathered. Elena began experimenting with more fantastical cartography, creating maps that combine practical emotional guidance with imaginative visual metaphors. She drew the archipelago of career change as a series of islands connected by bridges of courage and boats of networking. She mapped the continent of new parenthood, with regions like the Sleepless Peaks and the Valley of Unexpected Joy. These maps felt like a return to something essential, a way of seeing the world that honored both practical navigation and wonder, both accuracy and imagination. The realization that her father had been trying to give her permission to see this way all along came during a conversation with her mother. He used to say that you were the most practical person he knew, her mother told her. But he also worried that you'd forgotten how to play, how to see magic in ordinary things. Those bedtime stories he told you. He was trying to keep that part of you alive. I did forget, Elena admitted. I thought growing up meant choosing between imagination and competence. I thought maps had to be either accurate or beautiful, never both. And now I think the most accurate maps are often the most beautiful ones. They show not just what's there, but why it matters. Elena's work continued to evolve. She partnered with schools to help students map their educational journeys, with hospitals to help patients navigate illness and recovery, with organizations working with refugees to help them chart their experiences of displacement and belonging. Each project reinforced her growing conviction that personal cartography was more than just a therapeutic technique or an artistic practice. It was a fundamental tool for understanding human experience. By mapping their emotional territories, people could better navigate life's challenges, communicate their experiences to others, and find meaning in their journeys. Chapter 10 Full Circle. On the third anniversary of her father's death, Elena made a pilgrimage to the place where his professional life had begun, the State Highway Department office where he'd worked for 40 years. The building had been renovated since his retirement, but Bill Morrison, his old supervisor, had arranged for Elena to see her father's former workspace. He sat right there, Bill said, pointing to a corner desk near the window. Always wanted the natural light. Said it helped him see the landscape more clearly. Elena looked out the window at the view her father had seen every day for 4 decades. Rolling hills stretched into the distance, marked by the roads and highways he'd helped to map. It occurred to her that this landscape was itself a kind of map, a record of human decisions about how to move through space, how to connect communities, how to balance efficiency with beauty. "I brought something to show you," she told Bill, pulling out a folder. Inside was her latest project, a map of the Highway Department's 75-year history, created as part of the agency's anniversary celebration. But instead of showing just organizational changes and infrastructure projects, Elena had mapped the human stories behind the work, the territory of public service, with regions dedicated to the engineers who designed crucial bridges, the surveyors who'd mapped difficult terrain, the administrators who'd fought for funding during lean years. Her father's contributions were marked throughout the map, but not just as technical achievements. She'd included the Valley of Patient Mentorship, where Roberto had trained 3 generations of young surveyors, and the Heights of Quiet Excellence, representing his reputation for accuracy and integrity. Bill studied the map for several minutes, his weathered face softening. "This is beautiful, Elena. And it's true, truer than any org chart or project timeline. Your father would have understood this kind of mapping." "He taught me more than I realized at the time," Elena said. "Not just about technical skills, but about seeing the human dimension in everything we do." As they talked, Elena realized that her father's influence on her work went far beyond the personal maps he'd left behind. His approach to surveying, careful, respectful, attentive to the stories embedded in landscape, had shaped her understanding of what cartography could be. Chapter 11 The Teaching Map. That fall, Elena was invited to teach a course at the local university, Alternative Cartographies, Mapping Human Experience. The class attracted students from diverse disciplines, geography and urban planning majors, but also psychology students, artists, social workers, and even a few retirees auditing for personal interest. On the first day of class, Elena began by showing her father's maps. Traditional cartography asks, "What is there?" she told the students. But these maps ask different questions. What does this place mean? How do we experience it? What stories does it hold? These questions aren't less valid. They're just mapping different kinds of territory. One student, a young woman named Sarah, raised her hand. "But how do you measure accuracy when you're mapping something subjective? How do you know if your emotional map is right?" Elena had been asked this question many times, and she developed a response that honored both the practical concerns and the deeper purpose of the work. Accuracy in emotional cartography isn't about matching some external standard, she explained. It's about truthfully representing the mapmaker's experience. A map of heartbreak that helps someone navigate grief is accurate in the most important way. It serves its purpose. The semester's major project required each student to create a personal map of a significant life transition. The results were extraordinary. Sarah mapped her experience of studying abroad as a journey through the archipelago of cultural discovery. Marcus, a returning veteran, charted his adjustment to civilian life as navigation through the contested territory of home. An older student named Dorothy mapped her experience of widowhood as exploration of the unexplored continent of independence. But the project that most moved Elena was created by James, a quiet psychology major who had initially seemed skeptical of the entire enterprise. His map, titled The Geography of Coming Out, showed the careful emotional navigation required to share his identity with family and friends. The map included dangerous territories like the swamp of internalized shame and challenging passages like the Strait of Difficult Conversations, but also hopeful regions like the Harbor of Acceptance and the bright peninsula of authentic living. Creating this map helped me understand my own process, James told the class during final presentations. I could see that the difficult parts weren't just obstacles, they were part of the journey. They had their own geography, their own logic. Mapping them made them feel less overwhelming. Elena realized that this was perhaps the most valuable function of personal cartography. It transformed abstract emotional experiences into concrete visual representations that could be studied, understood, and shared with others. Chapter 12. Expanding Horizons. Elena's work attracted the attention of Dr. Maria Santos, a researcher studying narrative therapy techniques. Dr. Santos visited one of Elena's workshops and was struck by the parallels between personal mapping and therapeutic storytelling. Both approaches help people externalize their experiences, Dr. Santos observed. Instead of being trapped inside difficult emotions, people can step back and examine them, find patterns, identify resources they might not have recognized. This observation led to a collaboration that would define the next phase of Elena's work. Together, they developed a research project studying the therapeutic applications of personal cartography, working with clients dealing with trauma, addiction, grief, and major life transitions. The results were promising. Participants reported that creating maps of their experiences helped them feel more agency in their healing process. By visualizing their emotional territories, they could identify patterns, recognize progress, and communicate their experiences more effectively to therapists and loved ones. One client, a woman recovering from a difficult divorce, created a map showing her journey from the devastated lands of betrayal, through the wilderness of legal proceedings, to the emerging territory of new identity. The map helped her see that her painful experience had also been a process of discovery and growth. I always thought of the divorce as just destruction, she told Elena. But mapping it showed me that I was also building something new. The pain and the growth were happening in the same territory. Elena published several papers about this work, contributing to a growing body of research about spatial metaphors in psychology and therapy. But she was most proud of the practical applications, the growing network of therapists, teachers, and community workers who were incorporating mapping techniques into their practice. Chapter 13. Legacy Lines. 5 years after her father's death, Elena received an unexpected visitor. A young man named Miguel introduced himself as Roberto's nephew, the son of a cousin Elena had met only once, at a family reunion years earlier. "I'm sorry to bother you," Miguel said, "but my mother told me about your father's maps, and I was hoping I could see them. I'm studying art therapy, and I'm interested in alternative ways of visualizing personal experience." Elena invited him into the study, which had evolved into a combination archive and workspace. Her father's original maps were carefully preserved and framed, but they were now accompanied by hundreds of maps created by workshop participants, students, and research subjects. A growing collection of humanities' emotional cartography. Miguel studied the maps with the intensity Elena recognized from her father's approach to surveying. "These are incredible," he said. "They're like psychological archaeology. They show layers of experience that usually stay hidden." As they talked, Elena learned that Miguel's interest in the work was personal as well as professional. He was dealing with the recent death of his grandmother and struggling to understand his own grief process. I keep feeling like I should be over it by now, he admitted. But the sadness comes and goes in ways that don't make sense to me. Elena pulled out a large sheet of paper and a set of colored pencils. Maybe we can map it, she suggested. Over the next 2 hours, Miguel created his first emotional map, the territory of grief for Abuela. The map showed that his experience wasn't a linear journey from sadness to acceptance, but rather a complex landscape with different regions he visited and revisited as memory and circumstance triggered different aspects of his loss. I never thought of grief as a place you could explore, Miguel said, studying his completed map. I was thinking of it as something that happened to me, but this shows it as something I can navigate. Elena realized that this distinction was crucial, the difference between being overwhelmed by emotional experience and having tools to explore and understand it. Her father's maps had given her this gift, and now she was passing it on to others. Chapter 14 Full Survey. As Elena's work gained recognition, she was invited to speak at an international conference on innovative cartography. The invitation came from Dr. Jean-Claude Dubois, a French geographer who had been following her research. Your father would be proud, her mother said as Elena prepared for the trip. He always dreamed of travel, of seeing how cartography was practiced in other parts of the world. The conference was held in Florence, Italy, in a Renaissance palace that had once housed Medici court astronomers and mapmakers. Elena found herself presenting her work in a room where centuries earlier, explorers had studied charts of newly discovered continents. Her presentation, titled Cartographies of the Heart, Mapping Human Experience, was well received, but the most meaningful moment came during the question and answer session. An elderly Italian cartographer named Professor Romano asked about the relationship between personal mapping and traditional geographic work. Do you see these as separate disciplines, he asked, or as different applications of the same fundamental skill? Elena thought about her father, about his highway surveys and his fantasy maps, about the careful attention he brought to both types of work. I think they're part of the same practice, she answered. Good cartography has always been about more than just measuring and recording. It's about understanding relationships between places, between people, between inner and outer landscapes. My father taught me that accuracy isn't just about precise measurements. It's about truthfully representing what matters. After her presentation, several attendees approached Elena with their own stories about personal mapping projects. A Norwegian researcher had been working with refugees to help them map their experiences of displacement and resettlement. A Brazilian artist was creating community maps that showed the emotional geography of favela neighborhoods. A Canadian psychologist had developed mapping techniques for helping children process trauma. Elena realized that her work was part of a broader movement, a recognition that cartography could serve human needs that went far beyond navigation and planning. Maps could be tools for healing, for understanding, for connection. Chapter 15 New Territories. Returning from Florence, Elena felt energized and inspired. She'd seen the global potential for personal cartography, but she'd also been reminded of the importance of local, intimate work. She decided to focus her next project on something close to home, literally. She proposed to the city council that they commission a comprehensive emotional geography of the city, building on her earlier neighborhood work, but expanding it to encompass the entire metropolitan area. The project would combine her community mapping techniques with new digital tools, creating an interactive resource that would help residents and planners understand the city's human landscape. The proposal generated considerable debate. Some council members worried about the cost and questioned the practical value of mapping feelings. But others, including Mrs. Patterson, who had supported Elena's first project, argued passionately for the initiative. This is exactly the kind of information we need for good planning, Mrs. Patterson said. We spend millions studying traffic patterns and utility needs, but we ignore the emotional infrastructure that makes communities work. Elena's maps show us what really matters to people. The project was approved by a narrow margin, and Elena found herself leading the most ambitious mapping initiative of her career. Working with a team of researchers, community organizers, and technology developers, she began the process of charting an entire city's emotional geography. The work took 2 years and involved thousands of participants. Community meetings were held in every neighborhood, residents were interviewed about their personal connections to place, and historical societies contributed stories about the city's evolution over time. The resulting map was extraordinary, a layered interactive visualization that showed the city as both a physical and emotional landscape. Users could explore traditional information like demographics and infrastructure, but they could also discover the places where residents had fallen in love, where they felt most connected to nature, where they experienced community, where they remembered lost loved ones. One of the most powerful layers showed generational connections, places that had been significant to multiple generations of families. The old downtown diner where grandparents had met, married, and brought their children and grandchildren. The park where generations of families had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. The library where countless residents had discovered their love of reading. Chapter 16. The Cartographer's Return. The city mapping project's completion coincided with another significant milestone: Elena's decision to leave the National Geographic Survey and establish her own practice specializing in personal and community cartography. The decision wasn't easy. She'd spent over a decade building her career in traditional mapping. But as she explained to David, who had become one of her closest friends and advisors, the work had evolved beyond what could be contained within a conventional institutional framework. I want to help people understand that their emotional experiences deserve the same careful attention we give to geographic features, she told him. That means working with therapists, community organizations, schools, places where traditional cartographic institutions don't usually go. David nodded. Your father would understand. He spent his whole career working within the system, but his real passion project happened in his study on his own time. Elena's new practice, which she named territory mapping, quickly attracted a diverse clientele. Therapists referred clients who needed help visualizing their healing journeys. Schools hired her to help students map their educational experiences and career aspirations. Community organizations brought her in to help residents advocate for spaces that mattered to them. But perhaps her most meaningful work was with individuals who were navigating major life transitions. Like Miguel, who had become a regular collaborator, many people found that mapping their experiences helped them process change and identify resources they hadn't recognized. Elena worked with a woman mapping her experience of early motherhood, charting the territory between the island of pre-baby identity and the continent of new self. She helped a man nearing retirement visualize the journey from the familiar country of career to the unexplored territory of what comes next. She collaborated with a family mapping their experience of caring for a parent with dementia, showing how love could persist even as familiar landscapes transformed. Each project reinforced Elena's growing conviction that personal cartography wasn't just a therapeutic technique. It was a fundamental tool for human understanding, as essential as language or mathematics for making sense of experience. Chapter 17. Teaching the Teachers. Elena's work attracted increasing attention from educational institutions. She was invited to develop curriculum for graduate programs in counseling, social work, and community development, teaching future practitioners how to incorporate mapping techniques into their work. But the invitation that most excited her came from an unexpected source: the local elementary school where she had once been a student. The principal, Mrs. Kim, had heard about Elena's work and wondered if personal mapping might help young students understand their own growth and learning. Children are natural mapmakers, Elena told the teachers during a professional development workshop. They draw pictures of their houses, their neighborhoods, their families. We can build on that instinct to help them understand more abstract concepts, like how they learn, how they make friends, how they handle difficult emotions. The pilot program Elena developed for third graders was called Mapping My Year. Students created visual representations of their school experience, charting territories like the Playground Nation, with regions for different games and friend groups, the Learning Landscape, showing subjects that felt easy or challenging, and the Territory of Growing Up, marking moments when they felt proud of their progress. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Students who struggled with traditional forms of self-reflection flourished when given visual and spatial ways to explore their experiences. Teachers reported that the maps helped them understand their students better and gave them new tools for addressing social and emotional challenges. 8-year-old Maria created a map showing the Friendship Islands, connected by bridges of trust and communication, but separated by storms of misunderstanding. Her map helped her teacher understand why Maria was having difficulty with peer relationships and provided a framework for discussing social skills. Jaden, who had been acting out in class, mapped his school experience as navigation through the territory of feeling different. His map showed areas of isolation and frustration, but also highlighted his strengths and interests. The visual representation helped his teacher and parents develop strategies for supporting his unique needs. The program was so successful that other schools began adopting it. Elena found herself training teachers across the region, sharing techniques for helping students map their learning journeys, family relationships, and personal growth. Chapter 18: The Map of Maps. 10 years after her father's death, Elena decided to create a comprehensive map of her own journey, not just the personal growth she charted in the country of Elena, but the professional evolution that had led her from traditional surveying to this new form of cartography. She called it the territory of becoming a cartographer of hearts, and it showed the winding path from her early training in technical mapping through her discovery of her father's emotional cartography to her current practice helping others navigate their inner landscapes. The map was complex, showing how different influences had shaped her work. The confluence of grief and discovery marked the period after her father's death when she'd first encountered his fantasy maps. The mountains of academic challenge represented her graduate studies and early career struggles. The valley of professional doubt showed the period when she questioned whether emotional mapping was legitimate work. But the map also showed the streams of support that had sustained her journey: mentors like Dr. Santos, colleagues like David, and the hundreds of students and clients who had shared their own mapping experiments with her. As she worked on the map, Elena realized that it told a story not just about her own evolution, but about the emergence of an entire field. Personal cartography was no longer her idiosyncratic practice. It had become a recognized approach used by therapists, educators, community organizers, and individuals around the world. The map's most recent territories showed her current projects: training programs for mental health professionals, research collaborations with universities, and the development of digital tools that could make personal mapping more accessible to broader audiences. But the edge of the map remained unfinished, open to whatever territory she might explore next. Chapter 19: Generational Maps. Elena's work took an unexpected turn when she received a call from her cousin Miguel, who had completed his art therapy training and was working at a treatment center for adolescents struggling with addiction and trauma. "I've been using mapping techniques with my clients," he told her, "but I'm running into something interesting and challenging. Many of these kids come from families where trauma has been passed down through generations. Their personal territories are shaped by experiences they didn't even have directly." This observation sparked Elena's next major research project: intergenerational mapping. Working with Miguel and a team of family therapists, she began developing techniques for visualizing how family patterns, traumas, and strengths move through generations. The resulting maps were some of the most complex and moving work Elena had ever seen. Families would create collaborative maps showing how experiences like immigration, war, poverty, or abuse had shaped the emotional landscape across multiple generations. But the maps also showed how resilience, love, and wisdom had been transmitted through the same channels. One family, working through issues related to addiction and mental illness, created a map called the Archipelago of the Rodriguez family. Each generation occupied different islands, connected by bridges of shared experience, but also separated by waters of misunderstanding and silence. The map showed how trauma from the grandparents' experience of political persecution had influenced their children's struggles with depression and anxiety, which in turn had affected their parenting and their children's relationship with substance use. But the map also revealed strengths that had been passed down: islands of creativity, musical ability, and fierce family loyalty that had helped the family survive multiple crises. Seeing it mapped out like this helps me understand that my addiction isn't just about my personal choices, said the youngest family member, a teenager in recovery. It's part of a bigger geography, and that means my recovery can be part of changing the landscape for future generations. Chapter 20: Digital Territories. As Elena's work gained broader recognition, she was approached by a technology company interested in developing digital tools for personal mapping. The company, founded by a former Google engineer who had gone through his own therapeutic mapping process, wanted to make emotional cartography accessible to people who might not have access to workshops or therapeutic settings. Elena was initially skeptical. Personal mapping had always been, for her, an intimate process requiring human connection and careful guidance. She worried that digital tools might oversimplify or trivialize the work. But as she worked with the development team, she began to see possibilities. A well-designed app could provide people with templates and tools for creating their own maps, while preserving the depth and nuance that made the practice valuable. The resulting platform, called HeartMap, launched 2 years later. It offered guided exercises for creating personal maps, a library of examples from different cultures and contexts, and secure sharing tools that allowed users to work with therapists or trusted friends. But Elena insisted on including something that was often missing from digital tools: explicit acknowledgement of what the technology couldn't provide. Digital mapping can be a powerful starting point, read the app's introduction, written by Elena. But the most meaningful cartography happens in relationship with others. These tools can help you begin exploring your inner landscape, but consider sharing your maps with people who matter to you. The territories of the heart are meant to be known by more than one person. The app was successful, with hundreds of thousands of users creating personal maps for everything from processing divorce to navigating career changes to understanding family dynamics. But Elena was most proud of a feature that connected users with local therapists and community organizations trained in personal mapping techniques, ensuring that the digital work could lead to deeper human connection. Epilogue: the continuing survey. Elena stood in her father's study, now her study, on a crisp autumn morning 15 years after his death. The walls were covered with maps, but they no longer looked out of place or mysterious. They were part of an ongoing conversation about what it means to chart the human experience. Her father's original fantasy maps were still there, carefully preserved and beloved, but they were now surrounded by hundreds of others. Maps created by workshop participants, therapy clients, students, and community members around the world. Each map told a story of someone working to understand their own emotional geography. Elena was preparing for her latest project, a book that would document the evolution of personal cartography from her father's private experiments to its current status as a recognized field. The book would include examples of maps from different cultures, applications in various therapeutic and educational settings, and guidance for people who wanted to begin their own mapping practice. But she was most excited about the book's final section, which would be left blank, pages for readers to create their own maps, to continue the exploration her father had begun in this very room decades earlier. As she worked, Elena thought about the conversation she'd had with her mother the night before. At 82, Maria was beginning to experience some memory difficulties, but she remained sharp and insightful about the work that had grown from her husband's legacy. Your father always believed that love was a kind of territory, her mother had said. Something that could be explored and mapped, but never fully conquered or contained. I think that's what all your maps are really about, helping people navigate the geography of caring for each other. Elena looked out the window at the landscape her father had once surveyed professionally, roads and boundaries and measured distances. But she could also see the invisible infrastructure he'd taught her to recognize, the emotional connections between places, the stories embedded in familiar locations, the way geography becomes meaningful through human experience. Her phone rang, interrupting her reflection. It was a call from a researcher in Japan who had been using personal mapping techniques with earthquake survivors, helping them process trauma and rebuild their sense of place and community. They spoke for an hour about adaptation techniques, cultural considerations, and the universal human need to make sense of difficult experiences. After the call, Elena returned to her writing, but she was smiling. Her father had begun this work as a private attempt to understand his own relationships and experiences. Now it was part of a global conversation about healing, growth, and human understanding. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching a new map, one that would show the territory her work might explore in the years ahead. There were so many unexplored regions. Applications in refugee resettlement, techniques for environmental healing, tools for helping communities process collective trauma and build resilience. At the top of the page, she wrote, "The expanding universe of heart cartography, survey ongoing." Her father had been right, she realized. The most important territories were often the ones that couldn't be measured with traditional instruments. But they could be explored with patience, mapped with love, and shared with others brave enough to venture into the geography of the human heart. Outside, the autumn light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. Elena continued drawing, adding rivers of possibility and mountains of challenge to her map of what might come next. The territory was vast and largely uncharted, but she had good tools for exploration, and the knowledge that no one had to navigate these regions alone. In the margins of her map, she wrote the words her father had used to describe her as a child. "Here there be dragons, the fierce and beautiful kind." It seemed like the perfect way to mark the unexplored territories that lay ahead, full of challenges that were also opportunities, obstacles that were also invitations to grow. Elena worked late into the evening, mapping the future with the same careful attention her father had brought to charting the past. The conversation between generations continued, expressed now in the language they had developed together, the honest, hopeful cartography of the human heart.